What is good, everybody? My name is Taetro here with ujam. Today we're talking all about Virtual Drummer, who's not just any ordinary drum program. This is like having an actual drummer, not just the samples, not just the ability to play the patterns on your own, but an actual drummer that's going to bring you the drum grooves you need across the different genres that you're making, utilizing the different titles from Virtual Drummer. All right, I want to kick things off by playing you a few quick demos that I made with Virtual Drummer and a few of the different titles. This first one, Deep, is a drummer that sort of leans towards soul and funk, but is also great for like contemporary pop and other contemporary genres too. Next, we have Brute. This title's focus is punk and grunge. Next up, Legend. With a punchy, iconic 70s sound that cuts right through the mix. And the last one I'll show here, Hot. Hot is a title focused on pop music, with punchy drum machine-like processing which is meticulously engineered to sit properly in a radio-ready mix. And those are just 4 titles from Virtual Drummer, but as you can tell, just in those 4, we've got a pretty wide range of sound, and of course, you'll want to choose the right Virtual Drummer for the type of music that you're making. But let's dive in and start talking about how Virtual Drummer actually works. Hopefully you noticed across those different titles that even though aesthetically these titles looked different, the general interface is pretty much the same between each title. Let's start digging into that interface, and I want to start right here in the instrument section. So we've got 2 octaves here to play individual drum instruments: kick, snare, side stick, snare, rim, and you can see that each drum part is labeled up the keyboard. We also have 2 keys corresponding to mute and unmute, but we'll talk about those in a little bit. So essentially, if you have a MIDI keyboard, like mine here, you can play drums in real time. Also, in whatever DAW you're using, you can create empty MIDI clips and draw in notes yourself. So if I go to C1, which corresponds to our kick, I can very easily draw in a 4 to the floor kick pattern. And then I know the snare is on D1, so I can draw that in as well. So you can play in real time and draw in notes. That's pretty simple, right? Now I want to kind of skip the middle of the plugin for the moment and focus down here on the mixer section. If I play one of these drum patterns back, we hear all the drums playing, and each drum has associated with it a volume level. So I'm brought down the kick, I'm bringing down the snare, though you can still kind of hear the snare, right? Or you definitely can hear it still. Talk about why in a moment. But each individual instrument, if you can imagine a full drum set and each drum has its own personal microphone, that's the level that we're playing with there. So we can adjust the mix of our drum kit right from this section. This looks the same across different titles. Let's jump to Legend. You can see down here, I've got the same mixer section along with the same instrument section. Now I mentioned that as I bring down the snare volume, it's still kind of there. And you know what we can also do is we can solo individual instruments by selecting them and using the solo button. This is also a way to mute different sounds too. When I solo that snare though, we're not hearing any snare. When I come back, it's definitely there, but it's super kind of in the back, part of the ambience? Well, that's because we need to take a look at the ambience section. Because there are multiple ways to record a drum set, and one common way that recording engineers use is by using overhead microphones. So instead of having a microphone on each individual drum, they've got a pair of overhead microphones that kind of capture the whole kit. And also they capture the room. We can get a bit of room tone from mics that are not directly on a single drum. Here in Virtual Drummer, we're kind of using a combination of both, which is giving us a very authentic, real sounding drum kit. Because it basically is. So the reason that we're still hearing the snare despite turning it all the way down in our mixer is that because our overheads are turned on in our mix. And if I solo just the overheads, we get the sound from those mics that are placed over the top of the entire drum kit. So the hi-hats are coming through and the snare is coming through. This is of course something you can play with in your own mix to get a different kind of sound, but just know that as you start to go in and tweak the levels of each drum, the sound might not only be coming from the drum level itself, but it also might be coming from the overheads or the room sound. And if you want to find where exactly it's coming from, you can click on each of these drum parts, the individual drums, overheads, and room, and you can solo each one of these to hear what they're actually doing. In addition to soloing and muting our individual parts, you can see as I click through these different drums that we have a different set of parameters that pops up for each one. And if we take a look at the kick specifically, I'll solo it so we can hear it. We first have a parameter that allows us to change the type of kick, or basically the kick drum. We have a few different to choose from. And of course, the sample and the sound of each drum and drum kit, those are different from title to title. Here in Legend, we've got 5 different kick drum sounds to choose from. We also have decay, which will sort of be like the length of the tail of the note of the kick. Usually we keep that pretty long, but if you want a shorter, snappier kick, you would bring the decay down. We also have tuning. You want a deeper or kind of a higher pitched sound. And we have an individual reverb control. So as I go through the different instruments, let's unsolo the kick. And by the way, I want you to notice when I click solo on kick, there's a little indicator here that will light up orange. And that's going to light up the same for each individual drum if I solo them. Also, there's a little indicator light for mute as well, so you can quickly see what in your kit is soloed or muted. You notice on snare, we have the same thing. We can go ahead and change our snare types. We have a few different types here in Legend. We also have decay, tuning, and reverb. Each kit will have a unique kick and snare, but as you can see on the tom, hi-hat, ride, and crash, we have fewer samples, so those sounds will be reused across different kits. And if we keep moving down the list, if I click overheads, we have control over the compressor, a low pass, and a high pass filter. Let's go ahead and solo the overheads. And you can hear that I'm shaving off all those high frequencies with the low pass filter. And if I wanted to pull low frequencies out of the overheads, I could do that with the high pass filter. Compressor is, of course, is going to result in a higher volume level, but it's also going to reduce the dynamics. It's going to reduce the difference between the loud and the soft sounds the more we dial it up. And with room, we get the same options: compressor, low pass, and high pass. So you have a fair amount of control down here in this mixer section for each individual drum part, as well as the different drum mics that would be in use in a real recording studio. But we also have access to some master processing here. And I want to also draw your attention to the fact that if I click on each individual drum, I have the option to not send it to the master effects. I can just choose individual, at which point it will not go to the master. And look again, here we get an indicator that this part, that little blue light, means is not going to the master effects. So you have a lot of flexibility here, but I will send all of these drums and all of these sounds to the master and just point out here that we have reverb, color, and maximize. Unsolo our overheads. Obviously, reverb is going to make us sound like we're in a particular space. Color is doing a little bit of filtering, focusing either on high-end sounds or more of a focus on those lower tones. And maximize, we're getting a little crunchier, a little more compressed, and things are for sure getting louder as a result. We also have a selection of reverb presets that we can use to put our drums in a different space. So you can hear Don's delay comes with a little delay on this preset. Let's go to Steve's spring. That spring reverb, and those are being tied to this reverb knob here. So in the instrument section up here, we have access to all our individual drums. Down here, we've got control over our mix, and down here we have control over our master processing. Something very simple we skipped over is the fact that there are presets, and as I scan through different presets, we will obviously get different mix settings and different sounds. And they can vary widely, and they will be different from title to title. And maybe you noticed this, but this center section is also changing as I change presets. So what's happening here? Let me switch to a different title now. I just want to really reinforce that these user interfaces are pretty much the same, though they might aesthetically look different. So in Brute, let's go ahead and focus on this drum kit section here. This section does exactly what you imagine it does. It changes the drum kit. So there's 5 options here depending on what type of kit fits best with your song. Swing over here to the right side of the plugin and we have the mix preset. This is going to change the overall sound processing of our drum kit. Depending on what type of sound you want to get. We'll also have an amount dial here. So we can dial up that mix preset to be super extreme or a bit more subtle. And here we have an effect that will generally be different title to title, though it'll be in the same place. This one is called smack. So you can hear as I bring it up, we get a more of a snappier sound that sounds more like a smack in the face, I guess. That's Brute, the rock drummer. So here in the center section, we can choose our drum kit, we can choose our mix preset, and we can adjust the levels related to the mix preset or a distinct type of effect level that is different from title to title. Let's jump back to V deep so you can see once again. Same layout here. We have our drum kits labeled appropriately. We have our mix preset, the amount of our mix preset. And here in deep, we have grit, which is making these drums just a little bit dirtier. All right, so we've looked at how to mix the drums, we've looked at how to play them individually, but you know what? No matter how much I practice my finger drumming, I'll probably never sound like a real drummer at a drum kit. I don't know, maybe there's some finger drummers out there that can. So what I want to show you now is probably the most fun part of Virtual Drummer, and also the part that takes it from just being a virtual drum kit to it actually being a virtual drummer. And that is up here in the right where we start playing with phrases. And we get a few different drum phrases across the keyboard. Of course, you can notice that this is laid out like a piano keyboard, labeled C3 to C4. So if you have a MIDI keyboard, or if you're going to use your QWERTY keyboard as a MIDI keyboard, you can trigger these different patterns with your keyboard. You can also trigger things like fills with the keyboard. So what they've done for each title of Virtual Drummer is create these patterns that are real and authentic sounding to the genre that each title is based around. And if I open this drop-down menu here, you see that we have a whole list of different styles, each that hold their own particular patterns. They also have BPMs associated with them, so each one of these here in this list is going to sound best in a BPM range around how it's marked, right? So if I'm at 90 BPM now and I play some of these 88 BPM, even a 6/8 pattern here, which is really cool. But you can hear how it still sounds good even though it's 88 BPM in a 90 BPM project. We just have to be in the ballpark. Let's choose a new one, Acoustic Love. So I want you to notice how the keyboard is labeled here. We have verses from C3 to G3. That's on the white keys. These are patterns that are meant for the verse part of a song. They might be slightly lower energy than a chorus. And as I play some of these patterns, you can hear the difference. They kind of gain energy as you go up the keyboard. Staying on the white keys for a moment, then we have choruses. These are going to be the higher energy patterns that are built for the chorus of a track. Followed by specials. These could be fun little patterns that don't really fit either particular category, but still fit in the style. Same goes for breakdowns. This might be something you use for like a bridge of a song. And you can sort of like make build-ups from that. But you notice that these breakdowns are on our 3 black keys here: F sharp, G sharp, and A sharp. Now on C sharp 3 and D sharp 3, we have intros, and intros and fills and endings work in really interesting ways. If I trigger an intro, that intro is only a short phrase. It's meant to be the beginning of a song, and the plugin plays continuously knowing the last main pattern that we were on, so it'll always come back to your previous pattern. Fills work the same way. It's always going to revert back to the last verse or chorus or special pattern that you were playing last. So if I'm playing C4, this chorus, and I trigger this fill, we're going to start on C4. And we're going to do that fill. Now, maybe that's all well and good. That's how we interact with it, by just pressing the keys or just clicking on the notes here in the plugin window. But how do we get these notes into our DAW? It's actually really, really simple. If you notice that each of these keys has a small grid of 6 dots above it, if we click and drag those, here I'll click and drag this verse pattern into an empty session clip in Ableton Live. And now if I look at that MIDI clip, what we have is the complete MIDI for that drum pattern. And the reason I say that this is the feature that brings Virtual Drummer from just being another drum plugin to being an actual drummer is because you have to look at the nuance in the playing of this pattern. Human players are never completely on the grid, and as I start to zoom into this pattern, you'll notice that some of these hits are slightly, ever so slightly off the grid, like this beat 2 snare. And if I look over again at beat 4 snare, this one is even more off the grid, as well as the additional hi-hat sound. But when you play it back, it has a very human sound. And that's not the only parameter that's contributing to that very realistic human sound. It is also the velocity. If I bring this menu up here, each of these little nodes represents the velocity of a note. So if I select this note here, you can see its velocity is here. And actually, let me select all of the hi-hats for a moment, and you can see that each of these nodes has been highlighted, and they are varying throughout this pattern in a very natural way. That is all contributing to a very realistic sound from Virtual Drummer. So being able to just pull these patterns in and not having to actually play in notes or draw them in meticulously with that nuance, we already have all these patterns ready to go in Virtual Drummer's styles, all ready to be dragged in as MIDI into your DAW. Now, there's actually another way to get these patterns to play in your DAW, and that's by actually triggering those notes with MIDI that we just draw. So see, what note was I just playing here? A3. If I just draw in an A3 MIDI note here and extend it for the 4 bars and press play on that clip, now that MIDI is just triggering the plugin to play that pattern. So you can see the difference. There's two ways to go about it. One might be better for you. I prefer to have complete control over all the individual MIDI notes by dragging the MIDI patterns in, but you can also do it the simple way and just program a single note in your piano MIDI roll clip. Now there's a couple controls that we didn't talk about that we kind of like skipped over before. We have mute and unmute as well as stop. We can use these MIDI notes to either mute, unmute, or stop our clip. So if I use stop over here on B4, even though my clip is playing, if I program a B4 in this MIDI clip, let's program it on beat 2, our drum loop should stop. So it's a good way if you had your pattern going in your arrangement of your song, but you needed the pattern to stop somewhere because of your song structure, because that's what the song calls for, you can program a stop note right in there. Same goes for mute and unmute. So it's a way of using the MIDI piano roll to not only just play and program notes, but to also tell the plugin to do something like mute or play this pattern. This is also how we program fills. So remembering that fills are on F sharp 3, G sharp 3, and A sharp 3. We can exit out of Virtual Drummer and just look at our MIDI piano roll. I'm going to get rid of our little stop MIDI note. And let's go ahead and put a fill in here somewhere, finding F sharp 3, drawing that note in. And let's drag it over to beat 2 and let's just do a fill right off the bat. Now that that note is here, we should get our original pattern, a fill, and then back to our original pattern. Let's hear it back. And you can hear that the fill's not coming in right away because the plugin is smart enough to know where the fill needs to fit within the phrase that's already happening. Now let's jump back to this little demo here. I love this little tune here, but this was made with Hot, the pop style Virtual Drummer title. This pattern that we're hearing, actually, let's solo it for a moment, is actually a combination of a few different patterns, which is what makes it sound so cool. It's a combination of different patterns and fills. So let me show you how I would go about building one of those in my DAW. Remember that when I drag in this MIDI, we're gonna get a loop, a MIDI loop. If we take a look at this piano roll, we have a 4-bar loop here. And it's just a repeating 4-bar loop. That's totally fine. Let's pick another pattern from Virtual Drummer that we might want to combine with this. I like this one because it has that little roll in it. I'm going to drag this into my clips as well and save it for later. And then I also want to hear this fill. That's pretty cool. Let's hear this one. That's also pretty cool. I'm going to drag in this fill here separately. All right, here's how I'm going to go about this in Ableton Live. It'll be a similar workflow in other DAWs, but basically we just want to get these 3 MIDI clips onto a linear timeline. So I'm going to grab these 3 clips by holding Shift, drag these clips in, and drop them in onto the proper track. And now let's have this soloed and give this a listen. We just have the same patterns we just dragged in, but they are all separate, right? So I want to kind of combine these and maybe I want to alternate them. So what I can do is just count the bars. If I want 1 bar of the original pattern and then I want to switch to this new pattern, I'll just slice it up and put them side by side. That makes for a pretty cool pattern. We've just combined 2 different ones, but we also have this fill. When we drag things in like fills and intros, they might have a little bit of empty space. It's a 1-bar clip, but the notes really don't start until after beat 2 of this bar. So one way I like to combine these is just Command A and select all of these notes in the fill, remembering that this first note is coming in on beat 1.2.3 if you want to put it in DAW terms. So beat 0.2.3, I'm going to look at this clip here, and I know I want this to happen in the 4th bar. So I'm going to find bar 4.2.3. From there, delete all of the notes in the original pattern after that beat, and then Command V, paste in our notes on that beat. So now we have that fill happening in that little phrase. So now let's listen to this whole phrase together. Pattern 1, pattern 2, back to pattern 1. We're going to have the fill. So now we have a much more complex pattern, right? Now these are all chopped up. So in Ableton Live, we can consolidate them by hitting Command J. And now we have one solid 4-bar pattern that is a combination of the different patterns we pulled out of Virtual Drummer. So that's just sort of a next level method for combining these already awesome patterns and make the song even more your own. Let's hear how this one sounds in context. Little thing before we end here, I just want to point out also that Hot leans more into the pop world, of course, so you're going to get slightly more electronic sounds. But Hot is also, I think, the only title with a clap sound. And we have one more thing to take a look at here. Let's go back to our little funk jam with Legend. And we're going to solo the drums. So I want to show you the micro timing menu. If I open this up, this is going to allow us to change the timing, the speed, the feel of the drums. So with speed, we can get half-time feel or double time feel. That sounds a little frantic. We also get push and pull. So you can have your drummer be pushing the tempo, being a little bit ahead of the beat, or pulling back a little, being a little bit behind. And then we can also increase the swing. A lot of these patterns, oh, you can really hear it there, actually. Yeah, that sounds really good. A lot of patterns have a little bit of swing in them already, but you can increase that. And then we also have humanize. We talked about before about things being a little off the grid to make it sound more human. Of course, the more loose you go, the more extreme that will be. And of course, if you go all the way over to tight, you'll be more drum machine-like, more straight up on the grid. Now, important to note here, if you use my technique of dragging in the MIDI and dropping it in, now we have all of this already printed to MIDI. Like these notes, the velocity, the timing, and everything is already there. So if I go to adjust the micro timing now, it's not going to affect this pattern at all. If you use the method where you draw in a single note to play the pattern, the micro timing will obviously have an effect. That being said, if you adjust the micro timing, then drag in a pattern, those micro timing adjustments will be printed into that MIDI you just dragged in. So just be aware of that order of operations if you do want to adjust the micro timing. And for now, that's it. I hope you have a comprehensive understanding about how to get working with Virtual Drummer. Each title has a free trial, so definitely give them a spin depending on the type of genre that you're trying to make. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Taetro here with ujam. Have a good one.